has its potency as a political issue diminished?
No, it hasn't, because people are suffering. People can't afford rents. People can't afford to find houses. If you're on a single income, you're really, really struggling. If you're on government assistance, it's almost impossible to even find a room to rent in Australia's capital cities, let alone buy.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and the Prime Minister is in China this week, trying to strengthen ties with Australia's biggest trading partner.
And this morning we had a very constructive meeting with President Xi.
There couldn't be a more important time to strengthen an economic partnership and relationship which is full of opportunity but not short of complexity either.
It comes as the Trump administration continues to throw its weight around after suggestions that its AUKUS review might demand more money from Australia and a guarantee that the submarines would be used in a conflict with China.
Top Pentagon official Elbridge Colby has been pushing Australia and Japan to say whether they'd assist the US if it went to war with China over Taiwan.
We want peace and security in our region.
But with the first parliamentary sitting week just around the corner, global issues aren't the only ones on the mind of the Prime Minister. Leaked Treasury advice raised the alarm about the government's key housing policy and called on it to raise more revenue or cut spending. Joining me today to preview the first parliamentary sitting week and the government's political agenda is Australia Institute Chief Political Analyst Amy Remeikis. G'day, Amy.
Hello.
And with her is our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff. G'day, Matt.
Hi, Eb.
Amy, set the scene for us. We're heading very shortly into the first week of the new parliament. How does it compare to the last one?
Well, Labor have a thumping majority, so they can pretty much do whatever they want in the House of Representatives. The Senate is going to be the main game, as always, where we're going to see truly who Labor is and what they do with power, because they can either go just to the Greens to pass legislation, or they can go to the coalition, which was absolutely comprehensively rejected by the Australian people at the last election. So we've got a Labor government in power for about 6 years now, because the coalition would need to win 33 seats at the next election. It's not going to happen. They are not the federal arena is not Queensland, and they do not swing to a point where you're going to get 33 seats like switch over. In fact, I could probably see the Liberals losing even more seats at the next election, but that's probably another podcast. So we've got a Labor government in power for 6 years, which is not something that either the press gallery, Labor itself, or the public has really considered in modern political history, where you have, Labor in power for a long period of time. So at the same time as you've got Anthony Albanese saying we need to stick to our mandate and we need to just kind of keep this small target, theory going, you also have people in there just going, wow, we can actually change the country because we have another term after this guaranteed, and who knows what's going to happen to the coalition. And that's a really interesting place to have your politics because it's not something we've considered, a stable Labor government. And so it's going to be really telling how they use power. They've got enough seats to afford to be brave. They've got the conditions for boldness and bravery. You can lose a few seats in the House of Representatives and still have a thumping majority. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they have the appetite to actually do that, still to be seen.
We sacrificed sovereignty, or the government sacrificed sovereignty to get security. And it actually looks like we're going to lose both. My message is very clearly, sovereignty is absolutely paramount. We have to be able to defend ourselves, because ultimately the only people we can truly count on are each other, Australians.
So Even though we're kind of thinking about what the next parliament looks like, in the last week or so, global issues have really dominated the news cycle, and probably really since the federal election. How have you seen the government's efforts, particularly to manage this tricky relationship with Donald Trump's America and the instability that we're seeing there?
It's probably the defining issue and agenda item and just, I say, vibe for this government. While they've tried really hard to stick to domestic issues, no one's concentrating on when they're going to pass the HEX bill or not. It is all about how is Australia going to position itself in this new global world. And Donald Trump is unpredictable. Donald Trump is untrustworthy. Donald Trump is batshit crazy. And that is not something that you can necessarily plan for. And so what you've got is Anthony Albanese, who's been trying to stick to the old lines of, you know, Australia's friendship with the United States endures no matter who leads it. We're starting to see a little bit of a shift. And you mentioned in the beginning there the extra conditions that are coming down as part of AUKUS. The most important one, and one that Malcolm Turnbull has spoken about many times, including on podcasts with the Australia Institute, is whether Australia's sovereignty will be impacted. And Donald Trump's administration says the quiet part out loud, which is yes, you need to pre-commit to a war with China if we decide to go in with one, if you want to get these submarines.
Yeah, I almost feel like he's done the Australian public a favour in saying it out loud, because while Malcolm Turnbull and many other people have kind of raised this prospect that actually this deal really has the ability to compromise our sovereignty, everyone's kind of just hand-waved that away, and all of a sudden it's a genuine no, like now your colours to the mast.
I mean, it's not new. The Biden administration would have expected that Australia would, you know, commission these submarines in a war against China if America went to war under Biden. It's just Donald Trump has just made it very clear in black and white. Yeah, we want the submarine, and we want it, you know, even if it has an Australian flag on it, to come with us to war with China. And so you're starting to see Anthony Albanese start talking a lot more about sovereignty in his speeches. He did a recent John Curtin oration where he basically just spoke all about Australian sovereignty and about how Australia is going to decide its own future.
Curtin restored in Labor what he revived in Australia: unity and purpose in times of crisis and uncertainty. And above all, the confidence and determination to think and act for ourselves.
And you're seeing in the background the government do a lot of work to diversify on trade, so we're not so reliant on the United States for what comes into us, and also really starting to strengthen relationships with China. Anthony Albanese is at the beginning, as we record this, of a 6-day trip to China, where it's all about building those links, increasing the amount of trade, and reinforcing that Australia is a trading nation that sticks to its word, because that's something that, you know, America is not currently doing at the moment. And that's all kind of meant to send a warning to Washington that Australia will look elsewhere if we have to. Not necessarily for defense. I don't think that Australia is going to start signing, you know, AUKUS pacts with China. But we are basically signaling to Washington in very diplomatic ways that we will do what is best for our region. Does that mean that we're actually going to cut AUKUS? I don't think that we will do it. I don't think that this government is bold enough to actually take that step. But I do think that when America or the UK let it come to its inevitable end, Australia probably won't make as much noise as they might have a year ago about it.
On hold, Chris. On hold.
That is a big surprise.
On hold.
Okay, Michelle Bullock has decided to hold fire.
Home buyers and mortgage holders have been banking on this cut. They've been factoring it into their budgets. Have they been betrayed today?
No, I don't think we're betraying anyone, because, as I went back to earlier, I think betrayal would be to let inflation get out of hand.
Matt, the RBA made what I think was a rather odd decision and a bit of a surprising one for a lot of commentators, to keep rates on hold rather than cutting them. What does that mean for the economy and how the RBA views the economy?
Yeah, it was a really weird decision. Pretty much across the board, people are expecting a cut. And the reason they were expecting a cut was because all of the economic data told them that they should cut. The inflation rate is well within the RBA's bound and has been for a number of months, as in sort of 9 months, I think now, 3/4. We've been in between 2 and 3%. And also the economy is struggling. The last quarter of economic growth was 0.2%. You don't have to go much lower than 0.2% before you're negative. So it's barely sort of
chugging along.
And so that in those sort of circumstances, it was time for a cut. But the RBA said no, they were going to hold. They said that they needed more information. To be honest with you, Eb, I don't know what more information they need. But we get another quarterly inflation read at the end of July. That'll probably tell them that, again, inflation is well within the RBA's band. And, they'll probably then cut in August and pretend that was the plan all along.
But as far as the RBA is concerned, the economy's still too hot and too many people are employed.
Yeah, I think the second part is the main thing. I think that they continue to worry, despite all the evidence, that unemployment is too low. And just to be clear, unemployment is currently just above 4%. Over the last kind of several years, it has been at about that rate or down to 3.5%. And in those years, we have never seen a massive explosion in wages.
Yeah.
So, if it hasn't happened over the last couple of years, it's probably not going to happen. But the RBA are just wedded to this idea that low unemployment means sudden wages outbreak, which leads to higher prices, even if the evidence says the exact opposite.
And the other thing that came out this week was a story in the ABC related to an FOI and some Treasury advice that they'd been seeking. What did that turn up?
Yeah, it was an unusual one. So there's basically ABC had FOI'd the Red Book, which is the kind of advice that the public service gives to a new government, in this case, the re-elected Labor government.
Well done, Dan Ziffer, journalist there, for remembering to do that.
Great get.
And normally it's, basically just a heap of blacked out pages. But somebody stuffed up in Treasury and they released some sort of headings and tables of content sort of stuff. And from that, we worked out that basically Treasury is saying that the government needs to tax more, increase taxes in order to bring the budget or reduce the budget deficit. And that the other big item out of it was that their 1.2 million homes over 5 years, that target is not going to get reached and they should abandon it.
According to Treasury.
To be clear.
This is advice that Treasury gives where they're saying we've looked at the numbers and we think this. But I'm probably going to have to, I'll get chased out of the press gallery for this. I think the big drama around this story is a bit stupid. Because, it's not exactly earth-shattering for Treasury to be all like, oh, no, the budget's in trouble. You either need to raise more revenue or cut services. Or by the way, that housing target that you've already missed a bunch of targets on is not going to actually be completed on time or on target. Because turns out, oh, my God, we don't have the workers and we don't have the materials and all of the major infrastructure you need to do this is already commissioned to other projects that you need to actually build cities and towns.
Yeah.
I didn't actually think it was that big a deal because we know this. Like, we know exactly all of these things. Matt, you talk about it all the time, how the Treasury is going to have to come up with a way of actually raising some money if we're going to meet promises.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, Matt, because it feels like whenever we talk about tax reform, actually the media only generally means tax cuts. But here you've got Treasury saying what we always say, basically, like the only options if you want to provide more services is to collect more revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a discussion about which ways that you want to do that, what things you want to tax more of, tax concessions you want to tackle and things like that. Or you can either go further into deficit or you can cut services. Those are pretty much your only ever options, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly right. And the fact that this is so obvious kind of belies the debate we've had in this country, the stupid debate we've had in this country about budgets. And that is that, we're going to be able to just cut services, which they can never do because it's political suicide, or we're going to just grow the economy faster and that will solve the problem. And both of those, don't. And basically Treasury is saying we need tax reform, and that tax reform should result in higher taxes. And look, the Treasurer is having a big roundtable, next month. And, what Treasury have basically said is that we need to increase taxation. And that's what the focus of that roundtable should be.
What would some of the things be that you would put on the agenda for that if you had your druthers on tax reform? What are some of the big things we really need to tackle?
Yeah, look, taxing resources, particularly gas. We could stop giving away our gas for free, for example.
Stop it, Matt. Way too radical.
We could cut fossil fuel subsidies. We could reform negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, which would not only raise tens of billions of dollars, but it would also make housing more affordable. We could reform, handouts or tax loopholes to super. And actually Treasury raised that specifically in their brief, going further even than the government, which is increasing the tax on people, with accounts over 3 million.
Yeah.
We could actually go further than that. We could stop, subsidies to giant luxury utes. There are all kinds of ways we could raise revenue. And incidentally, none of those involves slugging kind of low and middle income earners. It's all the tax loopholes and tax concessions and the kind of free giveaways to big business. If you just close those down and crack down in that area, you could raise billions and billions of dollars. And remember, Eb, I know you've heard me say this before, but Australia is a low tax country. If we were just the average of the developed world, we'd be collecting an extra $140 billion a year.
It's not small change, is it, Amy?
No, but it all kind of seems a bit linked, doesn't it? Like what you were saying with the RBA's obsession with, oh my God, we've got too many people employed. The answers always seem to be that at least are being pushed out by bureaucracies or an RBA, which now has an extra board full of like business people and heartless economists, is that you basically just—
Thanks, Amy.
Not all economists, Matt.
Not all economists.
Is that you basically just have to keep slugging lower and middle income people in order to make the country work. It's like everyone who runs these institutions has forgotten that you can actually target the people who hold the wealth in order to make things fairer. And I think you see Jim Chalmers at times allude to that sort of stuff, but then you see the response to, a story about shock horror subheadings. Treasury says we need more money. And the automatic response is, oh my God, we're going to have to tax people more. It always just seems to be that we are stuck on this one idea of how we fix this.
Yeah.
And I think that until we actually create some more political space to be all like, oh no, hey, you should be angry at the people up the top and the corporations up the top, we're not going to see change.
There are a menu of options. It's not just this one option all the time that we're talking about. Amy, the housing supply conversation that we've been having with the government, or Treasury advising the government, think it's going to miss that target. I mean, housing and the fact that people are really struggling to get into affordable housing was such a huge feature of the last election. What do you think this government will be doing, or this parliament? Do you think it's going to be as big of an issue with Labor having such a thumping majority, even if it is going to miss this target? Has its potency as a political issue diminished?
No, it hasn't, because people are suffering. Like, people can't afford rents. People can't afford to find houses. If you're on a single income, you're really, really struggling. If you're on government assistance, it's almost impossible to even find a room to rent in Australia's capital cities, let alone buy. And so this is not an issue that is going to go away, and politicians might ignore it, but that doesn't mean that the people do. And Labor should also remember that it is facing a lot of challenges on its left flank, and that it did almost lose seats to independents and to the Greens, even when the national swing was with them. And people are out of patience. They no longer have time for governments to say, oh, we're going to do this and increase supply, when there are already, as Matt has said, several levers that they can pull that can immediately change the housing situation. They can change some of those tax concessions, even if it's just for the capital gains tax. And so, as Matt has pointed out many, many times, where you have investors betting on the housing market continuing to increase. And when that happens, rentals continue to increase because people have got giant mortgage payments that they want renters to pay as basically passive income.
Yeah.
So you could address that with just the capital gains tax, which was never meant to be used in the way that it's being used in the housing market. Same with negative gearing. Peter Costello and John Howard came up with that as a way to create business investment in Australia. And then a few accountants worked out that it also applied to housing. And what do you know? We've had this explosion. You could change some of the existing empty properties that we have, that state governments already have, into housing for people. You can put in rent controls so that you can't actually raise rents above, a fair market level. There are so many things that government could actually do, but they're choosing not to. But they're also ignoring the fact that the political power in this country is shifting. It's no longer boomers who are holding the demographic, chokehold on politics anymore. It's their children and their grandchildren who cannot afford housing. If anyone thinks that that is not going to cause some sort of cataclysmic political shift over the next few years, then you are not paying attention, or you're too wealthy to care.
Yeah. I mean, Matt, Amy's talking about the politics of it there, but you and I have discussed in the past not just kind of tax changes that we could make that help on those things, but also things like actually the government can just build housing. It doesn't have to outsource it to the private sector.
And it used to do that.
Yeah.
And when it did that, back in sort of the 50s, 60s and 70s, guess what? Housing was affordable. And if you look around the world and you look at countries that are doing it well, that do have affordable housing, they have one thing in common, and that is a government with a big stake and a big hand in housing.
Yeah, we really seem to have forgotten that public housing was ever a thing that existed.
I mean, like when you look at the wealthiest generation being boomers, and not all boomers, but a lot of that housing came because their own parents got that either heavily subsidized from the government or it was free from the government. And so that basically just meant that housing prices were normalized for that generation. It shouldn't be that if you are in your 40s and finally able to even look at the housing market, that banks are now turning to you and saying, sorry, we can't give you this loan because you no longer have enough working years left to pay it off.
Yeah.
And so therefore we don't see you as a good bet for this. I mean, what are those people supposed to do?
Yeah.
Unless you do some sort of fundamental shift where there is an interruption to what is happening, you are going to have an entire generation of renters, which is not terrible, but it's terrible in Australia where there are absolutely no rental controls that mean that you still have a house for life, even if your name isn't on the title.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the first item on the agenda for you?
20% cut in student debt, as I promised.
So, Amy, with Parliament returning and with such a thumping majority for the government, what is very clearly on the government's agenda? What are we expecting to come out the gate with?
Well, if they talked about it during the election campaign, then they're going to do it. And they've said that the first bill that they're going to introduce is going to be to lower the HECS repayments for people. So that's going to be one of the first things that they do. It's going to be a lot of pomp and ceremony. They're basically just going to come in and pretend that they're being exceptionally humble and that they don't have a thumping majority in the House of Representatives and that it's all business as usual and, all the rest of it. But there is a tension in the Labor Party, and I think that people will probably start to see that emerge probably next year because there's not that many parliamentary sittings left in this one.
Yep.
And there's not actually that much legislation that the government's got to legislate from its election campaign because they stuck to a pretty middle-of-the-road way of we're just going to continue doing business as usual. So I wouldn't expect too much in this parliamentary term, and I think that it's definitely going to be continued to be overshadowed by what's happening in America, what's happening in the global situation, and you're just going to start to see more of those tensions arise within the Labor caucus, particularly since there are still people who don't think that Anthony Albanese will stay Prime Minister for the entire term, that he may hand over most likely to Jim Chalmers. And you can see that Jim Chalmers is absolutely positioning himself as, you know, the heir to the Prime Ministership throne, or whatever it is that you want to call it in that analogy. And that is also creating some tension within Labor.
The amount of stories of this Prime Minister will hand off to someone else and the amount of Prime Ministers that actually hand off to somebody else, there's a bit of a disparity.
True. But Jim Chalmers studied Paul Keating and not Peter Costello, so there's a slight difference there.
Peter Costello. So if we can think ahead 6 months, maybe we're headed towards Christmas, the first 6 months of this new parliament. Matt, when it comes to the tax reform debate, what would you hope that the parliament, or the government at least, has put on the table?
Yeah, I hope that out of that round table, we do get some big ideas, and we get a government that is willing to prosecute some big ideas. I think the biggest problem that Australia has faced over the last decade or more is that governments are no longer willing to tackle big problems. They just want to tinker around the edges and make no real changes. And all that does is make all of the large problems that we have even worse over time. And so I would love it if they just picked something big and actually solved that problem. So that's my hope, is that we will at least get a commitment from the government to do something. Hopefully on tax, but, you know, on anything would be great.
And Amy, what would a good first 6 months for the government look like to you?
Actually just addressing the issues which are systemic, and, you know, we hear a lot about social cohesion, but we don't actually see government responding to people living in poverty, people who are suffering from inequality, people who feel like they're just being absolutely ignored by their government. And this is not business as usual times. So I think if we haven't seen any sort of boldness or bravery in the next 6 months, you're not going to get it, and that perhaps people should file that away in terms of what they actually want a government that represents them to be doing, rather than what they've actually got.
And a thumping majority means they can be bold. They can actually solve real problems because they have the numbers to do it.
Yeah, they've got some political capital to spend.
I mean, John Howard did it, so...
And changed the country for a very long time. I think, we're still living with the consequences of a lot of John Howard reforms. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Amy and Matt.
Thank you.
And if you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can pre-order the second edition of our Vantage Point essay series, Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us, by Richard Dennis, explores the contradiction between centrism and evidence that sits at the heart of democratic debate in Australia. You can pre-order it now for $19.95 or become a subscriber and save $15. Just visit australiainstitute.org.au or find the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 15th of July, and some things may have changed since recording. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.